All right. Good evening, everyone. My name's Matthew Gillikin. I'm one of the co-chairs of Livable Seville. Livable Seville advocates for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods for all. And we are thrilled about this event tonight. We're so grateful that we've had such excitement about it, and to have Sarah, Doug, and Jamelle here to talk to us about life after cars in Charlottesville. Um, I think that transportation and housing are things that go hand in hand. And we think about making Charlottesville a place that's affordable to live. It also needs to be a place that's affordable to get around and a place that you can get around in ways other than cars. And so Sarah and Doug are here to talk to us about that. And then we're going to talk to Jamel a little bit about what it's like for him living in Charlottesville, trying to get around as much as he can without a car. So a little bit about our speakers. Sarah Goodyear is a journalist and author who's covered cities and transportation for publications such as Grist, CityLab, and Streetsblog. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Doug Gordon is a TV producer and writer who is also a neighborhood safe streets advocate, better known online as Brooklyn Spoke. He also lives in Brooklyn. They host the wonderful War on Cars podcast, which I highly recommend checking out. And they wrote this fantastic book, Life After Cars, a book that now has its own Wikipedia page. It's that big of a deal. So one thing that Sarah and Doug have been doing as they've gone across the country touring to talk about their book is they've done some episodes about the cities they visit and what they saw in terms of transportation highs and lows. As I was trying to think about if we had them for a virtual event, how would we do that, a version of that for Charlottesville? And I thought of Jamelle Bouie, who many people know as a New York Times columnist, UVA graduate, Charlottesville resident. He does a lot of photography and 90s political film commentary. We tried to figure out how could we have a livable Seville event where he spent an hour talking about the best cereals in America, but we had a hard time working that into our vision statement. So he is here to talk about what it's like to be an e-bike dad in Charlottesville and to have kids in Charlottesville trying to get around this city. So Sarah and Doug are going to talk to start, and then we're going to kick it to Jamel, and then we'll have our Q&A time. So Sarah and Doug, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I'm going to share my screen, so hold on just a second and pay no attention to my browser and my desktop. So yeah, I just want to thank you all for being here. And yeah, it is unfortunate that we are not in Charlottesville to speak because I'm sure we'd have a really good time. Hopefully we can get down there. So I'm just going to run the presentation, talk a little bit. First off, just want to say thanks to Jamel for being here. He was a guest way back in 2021, episode 61, talking about being an e-bike dad in a less urban environment than the ones we live in Brooklyn. So Jamel, we'll have to have you back to maybe check in on how it's going now that you're a bunch of years into it. We've been on tour. Sarah, maybe you want to take this, talk about the name, The War on Cars, for people who are not familiar, and how we transition to life after cars for the book.
I'll just say
Yes.
people on when I've posted a link to this event on Facebook, they have not liked the name War on Cars.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
we'll talk about it.
They're
funny.
very troubled. And I said, "Oh, it sounds like you might want to hop on this webinar to learn the history of that."
I'm shocked to learn that people on Facebook have opinions about the title
It
The War
was
on
it
Cars. Yeah,
blew my mind when it happened.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's, believe it or not, not the first time that we've had some pushback on the name The War on Cars. We came up with that name because it's a phrase that has been used a lot in the media and by politicians anytime there's a bike lane proposed, anytime that some parking spaces might go away, people run out into the streets screaming there's a war on cars. And famously, a politician named Rob
Rob Ford.
Ford, excuse me, Rob Ford in Toronto, when he won the mayoral election, he said the war on the car stops today. And that's really, we decided to take that phrase and make it our own and to use it to try to get people's attention. And it is somewhat confrontational. There's no question about that. But I like to say that I read somewhere that something like 93% of podcasts only do 3 episodes or fewer. And we have now done, or I think we're about to publish episode 170. So I guess that something about the name did break through the noise. When we wrote the book, we thought it was going to be The War on Cars, the book. But our publisher, somewhat late in the process, said, "Hey, would you guys," and very tentatively, I think they thought we were going to get upset by this, "would you guys consider not having The War on Cars be the title of the book?" And we were open to the idea and had a brainstorming session with the people at Penguin. And very quickly, one of the people in marketing suggested this Life After Cars. And immediately we all loved it. And what I love about it is that it is a different kind of provocation because there's nobody alive today who remembers life before cars. And what we're really trying to do, one of the things that we're trying to do with the book is to try to get people to expand their brain to the point where they can imagine what a different kind of world that's a built environment that doesn't privilege cars might be like. What would life after cars be like? And so that's how that came about.
Yeah, so we figured we would just go through sort of like 3 or 4 different parts of the book, not do a reading because nobody wants to just hear us read, but just go through some of the ideas that are presented in the book. We start off really actually exploring that phrase, the war on cars, and we start the book. It was kind of hard to decide where to start in terms of, do you start in 1908 with the Model T rolling off the assembly line, as most histories of cars do? We started with Action Comics number 12, which was published in May 1939. And if you're a comic book nerd or know anything about Superman, you know that's where Superman originated in Action Comics. So this is just 12 issues into Superman's run. And in the story that's presented, Clark Kent comes out of the Daily Star, which is a precursor to the Daily Planet, and he sees that someone, in fact, a friend of his, has been hit and killed by a reckless driver. And this enrages Clark Kent, and he calls the city's mayor and says, we have a horrible traffic violence problem in our city. What are you going to do? And the mayor says, I agree it's a problem, but really, I don't think there's anything anyone can do about it. So Superman, Clark Kent, turns into Superman, breaks through the walls of a radio station, commandeers the airwaves, and says that more people have been killed needlessly by autos than died during the World War. And this is 1939, so he's referring to World War I. World War II had not yet begun. And if you really think about it, there had not been mechanized death on the scale that Americans were seeing on their streets outside of a battlefield, a foreign battlefield at that. And he declares war on reckless drivers. We did not originate this phrase, and not even Rob Ford originated the phrase. It goes way back to Superman and even before. He then goes on a rampage saying, I'm going to enjoy this private little war. This is him destroying the inventory at a used car dealer's lot because he's selling lemons and they're dangerous. He destroys all the tools and equipment at an automobile factory. He just goes on this like huge rampage and nobody can stop him. This is like a Batman version of Superman, like a renegade vigilante. He then even kidnaps the mayor of Metropolis, flies him up to the city morgue to force him to look at the maimed bodies of auto victims and says, these are the men that you killed with your lax approach to traffic safety. And we sometimes joke, there was all that controversy, made up controversy over the James Gunn Superman. As Superman's woke, he's an immigrant, and the right freaked out. Superman in this New Deal version of him has always been woke. He's always been fighting for justice and for fighting for social issues. So the question we ask in the book is sort of, why was Superman? This is before Lex Luthor. This is before some of his biggest arch nemesis. Why was he fighting the car? Well, this is Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman. And when they were born in 1914, about 4,700 people were killed by automobiles in the United States. By the time that Superman comic comes out in 1939, it's about 32,000 people. This is when the population of the United States is about 130 million people. So this is about a per capita rate of 30 per 100,000. Today, we're at about 37, 38, 40,000, depending on the year, a rate of only about 13 per 100,000. And we think, okay, that's more than half of what it used to be per capita, but it's actually twice as much as most developed nations. It's almost twice as much as Canada, which has a very similar built form as the United States. So that's where we started the book. We then divide the book up into various sections, one of which, and Matthew had asked us to talk about this a little bit, cars really ruin childhood. And we quote a researcher named Bruce Appleyard, just remember that last name for a moment, who is an urban designer and professor at San Diego State. And he did an exercise with a group of 9 and 10-year-old kids from 2 suburbs, 2 different communities. One with light traffic, where kids largely walked and biked by themselves, and another where there was heavier traffic, where kids were mostly driven around by their parents. And he used a technique called cognitive mapping, gave them pencils and crayon and said, I want you to draw your community. I want you to draw details where you go to school, where you play, draw sites of danger, anything that feels uncomfortable. Let's see what happens. And what he found was that in the light traffic neighborhood, kids identified 43% more locations where they played than kids in the heavy traffic neighborhood, fewer danger spots. They created very detailed maps of the street network. The one on the top that you see is from one of those kids. And you can see that it is like all of these different streets and how they connect to each other. The map on the bottom, if you sort of really zoom in and look at it, all of the destinations can only be traced for the most part back to the kid's home. So it's home, school, back, home, the park, back. And those kids expressed more feelings of dislike or danger. They couldn't give as much detail. And again, it was just a disconnected network. And here's a testimonial from one of the kids in the light traffic neighborhood. Who really likes being there because they have lots of friends. They're able to bike everywhere. They really felt connected to the neighborhood. And what Appleyard concluded was that as exposure to auto traffic volumes and speed decreases, a child's sense of threat goes down, and his or her ability to establish connection and appreciation for the community rises. And I think we know this intuitively, like this is what we want for our children, the ability to play, to roam freely. I think a lot of us are probably nostalgic for that in our own lives. So yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah. We're going to get to another part of the book.
Yeah, so another thing that we talk about is the effect that cars have on nature. And, really this is sort of, we conceive the book as like, trying to help people wrap their minds around all the different ways. And so cars ruin nature, obviously, are creating climate change and whatever, but we talk a lot about the effects on individual animals. And actually, when we were in Florida, I started researching about the Florida panther. I was just curious to know, and the leading cause of death for the Florida panther, which is the official state animal of Florida, is vehicle strikes. And there are only about 200 Florida panthers left in the wild, maybe even fewer. So every death is critical. And the state of Florida maps these deaths, these vehicle strike deaths. And in the lower left there, you'll see the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge, which is the little tiny piece of Florida that the state has set aside near Big Bend State Park. And you will also see how many panther fatalities there are and how many of them just correspond to these big roads. And actually, where you see Ave Maria on the map, that is a rapidly growing housing development. There are probably going to be more roads in this area, and there will certainly be more traffic. But the state of Florida, says that they really care about the Florida panther. And one of the ways that you can support, pretty much the most important way you can support the Florida panther, is to get a Florida panther license plate. And just the sort of the pain of that for me is just seeing these magnificent animals, And the very thing that is killing them is coming for them with a Panther license plate on it. I just, anyway. So cars ruin nature in so many ways. The noise, the pollution, the runoff from the roads kills salmon in the rivers of the Pacific Northwest. There are just multiple harms to the natural world.
Sarah, could you mention a little bit, I thought about tires and the
Oh
way
yeah, tires.
tire
Yeah.
particulate. So I think this is a thing that there's a lot of interesting things that can be said about electric vehicles and their advantages. Um, Talk us about some of the problems with EV tires in particular, but tires more broadly.
Yeah, tires more broadly. So there's some researchers in Washington State who had been investigating the cause of these mass die-offs of coho salmon that were happening year after year, and they would coincide with heavy rainfalls. Of course, heavy rainfalls also are what put water into the streams and signal to the coho salmon, hey, it's time to come up to spawn. And when these events would happen, you would have thousands of salmon dying at a time. They spent years and years trying to figure out what was causing that. And finally, after a lot of really dogged research, they isolated that it was a chemical compound called 6-PPD quinone, which is created when tires are rolling down the road and they hit they interact with the exhaust of the car, and it creates this poison essentially that just runs right into all the bodies of water around, and it's fatal to salmon. So the tire companies, say that there's nothing they can do about it. But I mean, it's really interesting that the tire companies hid for years. They wouldn't reveal what was in their tires because it was a proprietary formula and they're shielded to a certain extent. So it really had to be detective work on the part of the scientists. EVs also have tires. And while it's not fully understood if the dust from EV tires is as bad as from regular tires, certainly there is a lot of dust that comes off of them because the EVs are heavier and they actually create more tire wear and tires wear faster. And that's a huge portion. I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but of the plastic particulate pollution in our waterways, in our water systems, is from tires specifically, not anything else. So that's a huge thing, and EVs don't mitigate that. Um, we do also talk, we sort of move from nature because we're just animals, right? Cars also ruin our own health, obviously, but cars ruin society as well. Really take a huge toll on human society. And I'm showing you a picture of Haight Street in 1967 in San Francisco because that was around the time that the city of San Francisco decided it was going to put out a new comprehensive plan. It was going to think about what San Francisco was going to be like in the future. And so they hired a guy named Donald Appleyard. You may remember the name Appleyard. This is Bruce Appleyard, who did the research on children. This is Bruce Appleyard's father. And Donald Appleyard was very passionate about trying to figure out what was going on the streets of this country, partly because Bruce, his son, had been hit by a driver and grievously injured. And when he was about 6 or 7 years old, I think. And so Donald went into this saying, I want to find out what effect traffic has on the street and the social life of the street. So he and his researchers went to 3 different types of streets, the heavy traffic, the moderate traffic, and the light traffic streets. And what they found was really dramatic, that in neighborhoods in the light traffic street, people had 3 times as many local friends and twice as many local acquaintances as the people on the heavy traffic street. And not only that, people were moving away from the heavy traffic street. A lot of people who got stranded there were older people, widows, some of them who couldn't afford to move and who were just increasingly isolated inside their apartments. And they expressed often that they just didn't feel safe going outside, that they just went inside and stayed because that was what was safe to them. And so, this was all at a time when, as today, there was a lot of fear mongering about what happens in cities in terms of crime. And Appleyard and his fellow researchers did ask people, what are the top things that you're worried about in your neighborhood? And crime was not the top thing, it was traffic. And, I think this was still at a time when people could even imagine that maybe there didn't need to be that much traffic because many of them may have experienced times when there was a lot less traffic before the gutting of the cities and the interstates coming in and dumping all the suburban drivers in there. So Donald Appleyard wrote that visionary book, Livable Streets. It was published in 1981. And in it, he wrote the social relations that take place on the street, its potential for neighborliness and street life are values of urban life to be treasured. And, I really think that as much as anything, is a statement about what it is that we are fighting for in the war on cars is a street that has that potential and that lives up to that potential and where we can all have a more human and humane civic
Hmm.
life than is possible in an
Yeah.
environment that's dominated by automobiles.
And Matthew, maybe we can talk about this later because I'm sure it'll come up. But a question we almost get inevitably is, okay, you two Brooklynites, like with your subways and your city bike and your bus system and your sidewalks, can any of this apply to more rural or at least suburban places? And so I think we should, in a little bit, we can talk about some of the stuff we saw in other cities that's working. And not every place has to be Brownstone, Brooklyn, or Midtown Manhattan, but we could maybe talk about that a bit. But yeah, thank you so much. We don't want to take up too much time before Jamelle and we get to questions too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let me
so
stop that share.
Jamel, if you want to talk a little bit about your experiences in Charlottesville and what you like, what you don't like, and what you'd like to see moving forward with our transportation networks around here.
Sure. First, thank you for having me. Hello to anyone on the Zoom here that I know personally, and if I don't know you personally, hello anyway. Uh, so uh, Part of my perspective here, as someone who tries as much as possible to bike around Charlottesville, is of someone who has like a pretty high tolerance for risk. And so with a pretty high tolerance for risk, I find that I can get around a lot of Charlottesville by my e-bike. But if you don't have such a high tolerance for risk, if you prefer to, at all times feel some measure of safety, not have to be super vigilant when you're on a bike, then I think Charlottesville falls short in a lot of ways. On Saturday, I biked over to the No Kings protest, which was down 29 over by Stonefield. Um, and I was struck by how, as soon as I kind of left, the square mile from around where I live, it just became genuinely inhospitable to ride a bike. It's not that the distance was particularly far from, I think, my house to Stonefield. It was only like 3 or 4 miles, if that. But to get over there, either, right, from where I was, requires you to go um, uh, lots of back ways away from main traffic. Or if you want to take a quicker route, you basically have to get onto a main road and you have to be there. You even have to pass by an entrance and exit onto a highway to get to a place where you can kind of ride through a neighborhood and then end up in a more um, somewhat safer route to Stonefield. Even then, though, you still have to kind of like cross hydraulic to get over there, which is just to say that if you are like, and not even a protest, there's a movie theater over there, the Regal Cinemas. If you want to like ride your bike to go see a movie, you have to be very vigilant on your bike to get over there. This is the same as if you want to ride your bike down Fifth Street Extended to go to the Alamo Draft House. Again, Fifth Street Extended, it's just this long not highway, this long road, about a mile and a quarter long. That is like a straightaway. Like it's designed, it's designed to go very fast on. There are bike lanes that are like not protected, and then you get onto a street where the speed limit goes up, and there's no even attempt to accommodate people who might not be in the car, despite the fact that there are plenty of people who live in the area, and there's a grocery store, there's Wegmans, there's a lot of stuff over there. So you could imagine people might want to walk or ride a bike, but it's just not feasible. And so I suppose like my experience being someone on a bike around here is that if I want to go 5 or 10 minutes from my house, it's like not a big deal. It's pretty easy. But if you really want to be someone who's on a bike most of the time, Charlottesville's kind of inhospitable to it. And that goes for if you really want to be someone who's on your feet more often than not. There are plenty of places where sidewalks disappear, where you would assume there would be a sidewalk to continue. We have so many of these streets. You know, I live off of Elliott Street. We have so many of these streets, which are just very wide. They're just like these wide streets in the middle of residential places, uh, where there aren't sidewalks on both sides. There aren't very many crosswalks. There's a portion of Elliott where like it's one neighborhood and across the street another little neighborhood, little kind of courtyard style development. And you would think that there'd be a crosswalk or something because, first of all, there are bus stops there for kids. Second of all, you know, if you're walking your dog, it's like a natural place to go next, right? But there are no crosswalks, so you kind of have to brave this street where people are, you know, the posted speed limit's like 25 or 30. People are not going 25 or 30. And you gotta try to make your way around. And I feel that that's common all across Charlottesville. I try as much as I can to walk around a lot. One advantage of my of my job is that if I like grab like a voice recorder and go walking around like talking to myself, I'm kind of working, so I can do that. So I will just I'll just take long walks, and in taking long walks and I would ride my bike in Virginia Beach as well, but the idea of anyone who again doesn't have a very high tolerance for risk riding their bike in Virginia Beach is like it's like you have a death sentence, right? Um, so relative to Virginia Beach, Charlottesville, great, right? Um, but relative to any place where there is actually a lot more thought and care given to pedestrian infrastructure, that doesn't put such a high premium on the ability of cars to get from point A to point B as fast as they can, that thinks about the way roads encourage behavior, the design of roads encourages certain behavior, and whose sort of development patterns don't like presume car ownership, then Charlottesville, it's like not even a gentleman's C, right? It's like it's like a D plus or something. Um, and I find that really disappointing because I do think that given the relatively small size of this place, given the fact that like actually substantial numbers of people who live here either don't own cars or only own one car, and that plenty of people do bike and walk whenever they can, I do think that this place could be much more pedestrian and cyclist and bike friendly than it is. And it could do that without really any real burden on people who do rely on cars. Again, it's not as if this is like a huge place, right? It's not as if um, people are going to lose vital time if, uh, for example, this is one of my hobby horses. You turn Preston into one lane or one way on both sides, or if you fully pedestrianize the corner and just like closed off that street to cars and sort of routed them around that place. Like it's totally doable. When, as often is the case, I think that when you did it, or if you did it, there'd be like a month of complaining, and then people would be like, "Oh yeah, this is obviously better." But it's getting to the point where you can just say it is important for safety, it is important for kind of livability to do these things. That's difficult. And Matt alluded to it earlier, but or even say it outright, but last year, a pedestrian was killed crossing the street, crossing Elliott, and that as soon as I heard about that, I was like, of course that happened. Just you could sort of you could see it coming given the design of the road, given the number of people who cross it, given the lack of real concern for pedestrians, and it didn't have to happen. That's what's so frustrating, that these things do not have to happen. There's nothing written in stone that says that there has to be such a high rate of pedestrian violence. It's a choice that we make, a political choice that we make, and it's a choice I think we're currently making in Charlottesville, but we don't have to.
Tell us a little bit
So,
what it's
yeah.
like, um, and maybe Sarah, make your point.
No,
I,
no, no. You go,
as
Matthew.
a parent,
Yeah.
who I'm sure wants your kids to learn how to navigate their neighborhood, and getting to school, that you've got Fish Street, you're on one side, Fish Street's on the other side. Just what's it been like for you trying to figure out, you and your wife trying to figure out how to get your kids out of the car, moving around while making sure you're also keeping them safe.
I mean, right now at this moment, they're still young enough, right? That like I can put them on the e-bike. I have a Turn GSD, a cargo bike, and so I can put them on the e-bike and we can go places. And my wife doesn't so much bike around. We have a second e-bike around here. Um, uh, but if she were wanted to ride it, we could all go places on the e-bike, and it wouldn't on e-bikes, and it wouldn't be such an issue. The thing I think about is that I would like, as they get older, them to have just more mobility, to be a little more independent, to be able to go do things on their own, to see friends who aren't just like on our street, but like maybe would require a little of a bike ride, a little bit of a bike ride away, to walk to the downtown mall or ride a bike to the downtown mall and not have to like worry too much about about cars. And you know, my own desire would be for the city to develop its pedestrian infrastructure to a point where like that's going to be possible. But as it stands, I feel very nervous. My oldest is 7. When I was 9 years old, my parents would let me just sort of like walk through our neighborhood to a friend's house, right? Like we live in like a traditional kind of suburban development. I would like my 9-year-old or my 10-year-old to be able to just sort of like walk down to Ix, and I can give him like $15 so he can go get some tacos at Brazos, and it's not an issue, right? And even bring his sister along. I'm actually not sure if I would feel comfortable um, letting them do that, given the cars. Like their responsibility and maturity would totally feel comfortable, but like the cars is the thing I would worry the most about. It's why, my friends who have their childhoods in like proper cities, like in DC or in like Philly or New York, I'm always sort of like, that actually sounds great for an older kid, because like there's more options available for them to get around. It's not that it's like perfectly safe, but it's like a little more conceivable for younger kids to kind of just have a little independence in a way that I think is really important. And in a practical way, like I'm not a helicopter parent. Like I do not want to be hovering hovering over their shoulders at all times.
I will
Yeah,
say,
and
oh, sorry, go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, one of the points that we always make, Jamel, is that, oh, well, while he's doing that, is that it's freedom for parents too, right? Like that's the thing. It's being a parent is really demanding, and it's a 24-hour job in some ways. And if your kids have freedom of mobility, then maybe you don't have to get up so early on the day that they have soccer practice, or going to school, or I mean, but I can really relate to what you're talking about, Jamel. I also, like, even here in New York, which is relatively pedestrian friendly, obviously. I feel sometimes like, wow, I taught my kid to want to get around by bicycle. Like I taught him that because I grew up here and I grew up riding a bicycle for transportation, and I modeled that. I had him on a seat on the back, and then on a tag along, and then on a tandem, and then his own bike following along. And now, guess what? He's 24 years old and he likes to ride his bike around, and I have to think about that. And, but I made that happen. So, I mean, I think that's, we want our kids to have this freedom for ourselves, for them. And yet when we teach them these things, we are putting them out there into a world that has very little regard for them and doesn't seem to value them at all.
It's also the social connections that come with kids like this. My kids know that they can trust store owners. They bump into friends on the street. They see people that they just pass on their way to school every day who they may not know by name, but they know that that is a person. Maybe they give a polite nod. And so, I think especially now where we're in a society where there's so much distrust, to teach kids that other people in this world are people just like you, with the same problems getting their kids to school, or the bus is late, or like just learning to problem solve together is a really important thing. My daughter was on the subway, one of her first journeys. She missed her stop. She called me and she said, Papa, I missed my subway. What do you do? And I jumped into sort of New Yorker fatherhood role of like, okay, here's what you do. And she goes, you know what? Actually, I'm just going to ask this person over here. Click. That was it. And she made it home. And so I think, teaching kids that strangers, it's okay to trust people and that they will help you, that people are good, is another thing that comes. And that doesn't, again, have to be a Manhattan or Brooklyn thing. That can just be a sort of, these are the people in your neighborhood, Sesame Street sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
My kids are a little older than Jamel's. They're 14, 10, and 8. And my wife and I had a kind of high water mark on a nice Sunday a few weeks ago when the 14-year-old walked to a friend's house. Interestingly, this friend is on the other side of Main Street from us, and my 14-year-old's plenty capable with a bike, but we don't let him bike across that way because I don't feel like it's safe for him. So he walks to a friend's house. The 10-year-old bikes over to Fry Springs neighborhood where there's a group of kids that just roam the neighborhood on the bikes. Some of that neighborhood I don't love for biking, but it's like good enough, and there's usually a pack of them. And then the 8-year-old, she said, I'm riding my bike to my friend's house, and this friend lives on the other side of the park from us. So it's kind of mostly all just sidewalks, and there's no things to cross. And they all kind of went off simultaneously, and it was my wife and I are like, we did it. We're we're free for the next couple hours, and our kids are excited to have this independence. I mean, it is like really cool to see. I mean, the 8-year-old, she was like fired up about being able to do this, and just their sense of self. And the 10-year-old, this group of kids that he rides around with, they have gotten to know one of the bike mechanics at Endeavor Bikes in Fry Springs because they take their bikes over there, and they're super nice to them there. And it's like that's that wouldn't happen in the same way if I was even if I was biking with him over there. But to see these kids have their own kind of independent relationships with adults and with community members where they feel like there's trusted people and that they can
Yeah.
get themselves. And of course, I tell them you got to be careful at this intersection and that intersection. And I mean, I think they're paying attention, but that independence is something that's incredibly valuable. And as your book pointed out, actually like makes their brains work better in terms of their ability to function. Um, I'll just say for folks, if you want to put questions in the chat, and while you're doing that, Sarah and Doug, tell us a little bit about living in Zoran's New York City. It's, particularly as it relates to transportation and getting stuff done and local government actually following through.
I mean, it's great. I took my free bus to my free grocery store, and it's perfect. We're living under deep socialism here. No, as we were saying before the call, that there's a little bit of whiplash going on where you see what's happening in the federal government and with international politics, and things are just uniformly awful. And then here you wake up and you see that Mamdani is on a pothole filling blitz, and he fixed this really pesky ramp to the Williamsburg Bridge that honestly was as simple as just like shaving down and pouring some new concrete, but at least two or three mayoral administrations just didn't do it. And he's just getting a lot of simple stuff done. He's also taking on slumlords. He's doing some bigger stuff as well. So it's nice to see someone who is focused on getting stuff done. Now, I think he has a lot to prove, to the haters, the Andrew Cuomo's of the world, who think that this can't work in New York City. So I think he's got an extra incentive to just right out of the gate say we are going to make government work for people. But I think it's in his bones anyway. He would have done that regardless. So it's been really exciting to watch. First of all, someone who isn't 60 or above, leading our biggest city. The gerontocracy is real. So it's nice to see someone younger than us, at least me and Sarah, leading the city for once. And it's exciting. He's made people interested in how government can work for them. Because what is government? Government is us. It is what we decide to do with our money and our resources and our land and our talents and all the rest. So I'm excited. It's been really fun so far.
And I'd like to say that, one of the things that most excited me about his campaign was his elevation of buses as an issue, as one of his top three issues. Now, we can debate whether buses should be free. We had an episode about that. It's definitely debatable. But just the idea that people who ride the bus, who are the most stigmatized, the most marginalized, the most neglected and disrespected people in our transportation system in this country, that they would be elevated to be central to his platform. That to me was just so powerful and so great. And we have seen lots of substantive things coming out of this administration right away. And yeah, it's exciting to, especially at this moment in history. I mean, one of the things that we say about cars and kids and parenting is that you have more freedom and more choices if you don't have to be car dependent, and it gives parents more freedom, it gives everybody more freedom. But as we are staring at this oil shock that's happening and how ill prepared most American communities are to give their residents choices in terms of transportation. We just bet everything on cars. That was just the thing for the last several generations. If you could get 20% of the federal transportation dollars to go to transit, it was like such a huge, exciting event. So, we're paying the cost of that right now. And I'm hoping that there will be some visionary leaders in our communities who are able to take this moment and, say, look, this is what my city can do because we have diversified our transportation system. This is, now we have more choices. My people have more, they're not locked into $5, $6, $8 gas, right? And so I'm hoping that the combination of having a really visionary, charismatic leader in a city that is already several steps ahead of many other American cities, that he can do what he says he wants to do, which is to make the streets of New York the envy of the world and to really make it into sort of a model of what can be done in an American city. So it's an exciting time. But as Doug says, it's all like, the proof is in the governing.
Yeah, so along the lines of kind of proving things that work, what are some cities that you've seen or some steps you've seen taken cities that have been able to like really move forward with making things happen fairly quickly? Like what are some of the characteristics of those places, or what are specific interventions you've seen work well?
I don't think there's a specific characteristic that's common across every city. We have been to like urbanist paradises like Vancouver, but we also were in Atlanta, which really was a pleasant surprise in many ways. First of all, the Beltline, if you're not familiar with it, it's this when it's completed, it'll be this 22-mile loop of the city on an old rail trail. It's a multi-use path that goes through pretty much the middle of the city, but also some more suburban areas. And what's been really cool about that project is as it has connected more communities have demanded connections to it. So you don't just have the ring, you have, I live a mile away, I need a protected bike lane to get to it so I can continue my commute to work or wherever I want to go. That's been really great. When Jamel was talking about that one road he wants to see converted from, I'm assuming, 2 lanes on both sides to one on both sides. Sarah, I don't know if you remember when we were on that bike tour, we were overlooking this road that had that exact configuration, and the city turned it into 1 lane in each direction with a turn lane in the middle, and then bike lanes, pretty wide, decent bike lanes on both sides. And what was interesting about it is that when you got out of the city, they pointed just down the road. It retained its former form, and the number of crashes on that stretch almost immediately when you got out of the city were like 2 or 3 times what they were after they did the conversion inside the city. And this was in a neighborhood that probably wouldn't look out of place in a place like Charlottesville. So they were able to reduce crashes in that little stretch. Tons of single family homes, pretty decent distance apart. Um, we've seen it all, I think, and including in some really car dependent places. The Underline in Miami, which is an old the underside of their elevated the it's the metro rail, they've turned into a linear park. So, I think every city has abandoned infrastructure that could be reactivated as a railway or turned into an active trail. So yeah, we've seen everything.
But I think the one thing that all these places do have in common, we talk about three cities in the book: Ghent, Belgium; Paris, France; and Emeryville, California. And we talk about those three places, and what each one of those had was political leadership that was willing to take the heat and say, no, this is what we think is right for our city, and we're going to keep going with it. And, Paris is often held up these days as being this paragon of they've taken the River Seine back from cars. They've put bikes everywhere. There's school streets everywhere that have, are closed to cars outside of schools. And, that was all very unpopular, or there was a lot of vocal complaining about that in a very characteristically French way. But people really just were hating on Anne Hidalgo, the mayor, for years and years and years, saying she was ruining Paris. It was the destruction of Paris. She was abandoning all the values and whatever. She just said, and I got to interview her about this, but she said, look, I was trying to bring a better quality of life to the people I represent. And I know that cleaner air and and access to green space and nature and children being able to move safely around the city leads to a better quality of life and happier people. And I want my city to be filled with happy people and families who can safely recreate together. And I think that presenting that kind of a vision and having leaders who really are saying, I'm trying to make a better life for the people who live in my city, that is what unifies all the best things that we've seen. They've all been supported from the grassroots up, but there's got to be those people at the top who are willing to take the heat and say, I'm going to do this because I know it's right.
Great. Jamel, I want to try and get your thoughts on the Iran war and how that relates to a number of topics. But I guess I'm curious, Jamel, what you've kind of been thinking about as the war has revealed the way in which car dependency quickly creates some major, major liabilities for the U.S., for particularly anyone in the U.S. who is stuck with a car. I think for most people, that'll be the most tangible way they experience the war in the U.S. And maybe how not being car dependent is a form of anti-authoritarianism. What, just love to hear your thoughts. I know there's a lot there.
I mean, it's sort of it's hard to say at this point what impact, a likely price spike is going to have on people's choices and consumption, in part because there aren't that many choices offered. I think it's very hard for people to conceptualize, what it's like to not have to be in a car all the time. I do think that, you know, my hunch is that Americans will be more likely to take the price spike, like they'll be more likely to say, how can we get back to the status quo ante where I don't have to spend, a chunk of my paycheck filling up my car or cars, then asking, well, how can we avoid this altogether? So I'm really not certain about, for like the typical American, how much this is going to change things. But, you know, with regards to this conversation we've kind of been having about political leadership, I do think that especially at sort of the local municipal level, there are real opportunities for political leaders, for lawmakers to make use of $5 a gallon gas should it come, to make the case for more serious investment in transportation, more serious investment in the infrastructure that would allow people to get around without a car. And this conversation we've been having has been about the local, but Virginia has this plan for a big investment in its passenger rail network, right? And high gas prices are actually a pretty good argument for expanding passenger rail across the state, right? If you need to commute between Richmond and DC, if you need to commute between Norfolk and Richmond or whatnot, um, there's a planned expansion that is Stanton to Richmond. Uh, the case for building that out even faster is really strong, right? You don't want to spend hours on the road and spend $100 in a tank of gas if you can just hop on a train and get there. So I do think there's opportunity. This is opportunities for political leaders to make a case, uh, and we'll just see what happens um, from there as far as those things go.
Okay, great. Um, a suggestion for when the next edition of this book comes out, and this is based on my job as a speech therapist at UVA Hospital who works with adults, is that cars ruin life for the elderly. And I see
Mhm.
this like literally every day at my job, where people who have for 70, 80 years, or sometimes 30, only 30 or 40 years, um, life has been, whether they've been a driver, they've been a passenger, suddenly um, their options there are become much more limited. And I'm kind of curious, Sarah and Doug, if you all have thought much about that aspect of how car dependency as we age becomes pretty problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm dealing with this right now with my father-in-law who is 81, and we've had to have the difficult conversation with him. My wife and my sister-in-law have really had to have this conversation with him about we're not so sure that you should be driving the kids around. His reaction time is slower. Um, Outside of, in unfamiliar environments, he just has to take things a lot slower, and you need fast reaction times when you're behind the wheel of a car. The boomer generation, it's a real thing. Um, there's this concept, there's a planner and leader who has an organization called 880 Cities. And the idea is that cities should be built for the 8-year-old and for the 80-year-old, and then they'll work for everybody in between. It's sort of like a giant curb cut effect for society. And yeah, the loneliness epidemic is real. My father-in-law, again, hopefully he won't watch the YouTube. I'm worried that I'm talking about him too much. But, he has a regular breakfast with a bunch of guys, and it's on the other side of town. He has to drive there. And if he can't drive, he'll be stuck at home. And that social outlet will be taken away from him. So yeah, we've given this a lot of thought. Sarah can probably talk more to this. We quote an activist and researcher named Anna Zevarts, who has a book called When Driving is Not an Option. I mean, yeah, I'm sure many people are familiar with it.
She did a
And she
webinar
cites
with
this.
us. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, right. So, like the people in this country, 30% of people in this country cannot drive, and that includes people who have forcibly been aged out of driving or have chosen to give up the keys. And they are, for the large part, stuck in places that are not walkable because it's expensive to retire to walkable, pleasant communities like Brownstone, Brooklyn, or nicer neighborhoods in San Francisco. So it's a big social justice issue at the older end of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, and I just have to say the thing that I always want to say here, which is, we have a country where walkable neighborhoods have become a luxury good, and the ability to just transport yourself under your own power is something that's reserved for relatively few people and mostly in very, very high priced real estate. And as our housing crisis just deepens, I think this is only getting worse. I mean, I saw something saying that one of the reasons that Houston's Hobby Airport has the worst delays with the TSA agents out is that so many of the people who work at that airport live so far away because of the cost of housing and the sprawl development in Houston. And so it's been particularly onerous for those people to get to work and to pay for getting to work. And that's one of the reasons those have been some of the longest wait times. At least it was in the New York Times actually that I read that. So presumably a reliable source.
Depends on the topic. Um, yeah, so all right, well, we're going to move towards wrapping up. I do want to mention some of the things Charlottesville City is doing. We have Counselor Oshrin in our audience today, and she deserves a lot of credit. But the city is going to spend about $11 million this next year on transportation-related capital projects. $10 million over the next 4 years just on new sidewalks, $2 million a year on ADA improvements, and the plan is for the CAT, the bus system, to add 10 new drivers a year for a number of years in a row to help get frequency for CAT much better, which is frankly the only way CAT is truly going to be successful is until it's frequent and reliable. A few things, if you're wanting we always like to be practical as a group. So if you are feeling inspired to be part of Bike Ped ADA advocacy in Charlottesville, join BPAC, the Bike Pedestrian Advisory Committee in the city. And you can come to their next meeting this Thursday at 5 o'clock at City Hall. So if you're just like wanting to channel the energy of this event and excitement about making Charlottesville a better place to not drive, that is a great opportunity. I also want to highlight the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center has a couple of really awesome tours right now that are opportunities to explore our public spaces and the symbols that go with them. So I'm going to put a couple links in the chat. These tours are important for a range of reasons, but one of them is that Charlottesville is a place with a lot of symbolic history. It means every city has symbols that help define what it's about. And as Charlottesville tore down the symbols that built up white supremacy, many of us are thinking about and motivated by a desire to create a city that is a city that is accessible to everyone, that acknowledges our history of racism and oppression and exclusion, and uses that history to inform the ways that we act to help create a better city for everyone. These tours are an excellent opportunity to learn and reflect on that history and about what we can do in the future. One more thing is that the city is looking to improve Rose Hill Drive, and they're going to have a very cool open house in a couple weeks at the Carver Rec Center from 5 to 7 p.m. on Monday, April 13th. That's going to be partially focused on Rose Hill Drive corridor, but also on like how the city is starting to think about these topics. And last but not least, not this Thursday, but the following Thursday, come join us at the Ix Brazos for tacos and happy hour from 5 to 7. That is how we get to know each other and build connections and relationships with one another to help make some of these changes happen. So thank you very much to Sarah, Doug, and Jamelle. Thank you to all of you who joined us. Have a great evening, and thank you for joining the War on Cars.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having us.
everyone.
Thank you
It's
so
really
much.
fun.
Real privilege.